British Columbia Council, who we are, in case you're not very familiar with us. We are a network of networks of organizations in British Columbia. We're one of 8 provincial and regional networks around the country that organize the CSO side of things when it comes to international sustainability. So our groups work on often overseas, sometimes they work domestically, but more often overseas or in an international context. And we got interested in the SDGs before they were officially signed off and wrote a report, which you can find on our webpage. We have plenty of information on our webpage, which is bccic.ca. And that report led to a delegation. We went to the UN, we came back, and the big question that we asked, which was on everybody's mind, is how relevant are these sustainable development goals to people on the ground in our province? So if we went out to communities in BC, what would they say? And so we did that. We traveled around. Many of you who know us know that we put on a lot of miles, spoke with a lot of people, I think over 500. I think the final number was actually closer to 900 leaders in British Columbia and 32 communities to figure out what they thought about these SDGs. And the response was overwhelming. We have a map now, which you can find on our webpage, which shows you over 2,500 groups that are working in BC and the Yukon and Nunavut, and we hope to map the rest of the country at some point as a reflection of just how many groups see themselves as being involved in the SDG rubric. So the big question with the SDGs is that people say they're going to cost trillions of dollars to accomplish, that we cannot do it just with government money. We can't just do it with private sector money, and we sure can't do it with just donor money. So the question is, how do we put all these things together and come up with a way that we can actually get the agenda done by the year 2030? And just as a reminder, we're in the year 2018, which puts us about 20% of the way through the 15-year timeline, and there is plenty left in terms of the goals and so on. There's lots of upcoming events I'd love to flag for you. I may get a chance at the end, but I do want to say that there will be a major meeting on organizing the SDGs on March the 23rd that will be of interest to anybody on this teleconference call, and that'll be in Vancouver. And there'll be a lot of efforts going towards the high-level political forum later on in the summer, which there's some exciting developments around that as well. And there will also be a slew of hosted events this summer, similar to last year, like Together 2018. So just a few announcements on that. And if you do want that kind of information, either send us an email or tune into our webpage. I'm going to get on now with our speakers so that we can jump to the question period and the more interesting discussion and get some content going here. We have 3 speakers: Eugene from Oiko Credit. We have Jaypee from the Community Foundations of Canada, and we have Stephen from McConnell Foundation. And so I think we'll start with, maybe I'm just going to go left to right because you guys are on my screen left to right. I don't know how you appear, but I've got Jaypee, you're on the left. So I'm going to read this to the right. And what I'd love to ask you to do is just give us a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes on your organization and how you've oriented towards the SDGs, what it means for you, what's going on.
Sure, thanks so much. First of all, delighted to be here on behalf of Community Foundations of Canada to speak to a topic really that's been on our radar probably for the last year and a half, and that very much increasingly is showing up in much of the work that we're doing as a national organization. And that's, of course, connected to understanding some of the different ways in which the Sustainable Development Goals are landing in Canada and landing in our communities, what the implications of that are for philanthropic institutions, and in particular for community foundations, and perhaps most importantly, what some of the specific opportunities are that adopting an agenda like the SDGs has for individual organizations working across the country toward many of these goals. Now, before I unpack a couple of those opportunities, and I think a couple of the reasons why CFC is particularly excited about this agenda, I'll share a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Community Foundations of Canada is a national network that represents 191 public place-based foundations that currently operate in about 90% of all communities across the country. These are organizations that leverage local knowledge, local leadership, local resources, as well as local assets toward working on some of the issues that matter most at the community level. And of course, we know that many of these issues can be found within the 17 goals of the SDGs. Community foundations have operated in Canada for about 100 years now, and really for the last 25 years, Community Foundations of Canada as a national network has really worked at, first of all, expanding the reach of community foundations so that every community across the country has access to a foundation. Worked on really fostering greater connectivity and collaboration between community foundations working in Canada, as well as between community foundations and potential partners from civil society, from academia, the public sector, private sector, different levels of government, etc. And perhaps most recently, we've been very much involved in not only fostering that type of collaboration within the Community Foundation movement in Canada, but recognize that we have so much to learn from and to share with community foundations that are working in communities around the world. So I mentioned there are 191 community foundations currently working in about 90% of all communities in Canada. Well, that's really a small part of a much larger global network, which consists of about 1,900 place-based foundations, currently stewarding about $60 billion. And we know that many of these foundations are working on some of the issues that we're seeing community foundations working to address in our communities here in Canada, but perhaps bringing a different perspective. We also know that community foundations in Canada are increasingly grappling with challenges that certainly show up locally, but can't necessarily be solved for in isolation at a local level. And whether that's the impact of climate change, whether that's understanding the economic impacts of technological disruption, demographic shifts, migration, and refugee settlement, these are all things that are central to the work that community foundations are working on with local community organizations. And so, of course, we have so much to learn and share with organizations that are doing similar work internationally. And now I mentioned for the last year or so, we've been thinking a lot about the SDGs. And like BCCIC, we've really been across the country connecting not only with community foundations, but organizations across across sectors to understand what this agenda means to them, how it might be leveraged, and whether or not this is something that, as a network of organizations, we might want to adopt and promote here in Canada. And I'll really quickly draw on a couple of examples of what we've heard and what we've experienced. And I think really this panel over the next hour or so is going to be unpacking them in a little bit more detail. First and foremost, what I like to share with organizations who are perhaps new to this agenda is that the SDGs doesn't necessarily represent new work. We're incredibly beneficial here in Canada to have so many local organizations that are really driving and developing innovative solutions to many of the 17 goals. And so the SDGs is less about changing what you do and how you do it, but more about creating a framework to connect the work that you're doing at a regional level, at a national level, and at an international level. The SDGs also provides, really for the first time, a universal language that organizations can speak. It's one that allows a domestically focused network of organizations like Community Foundations of Canada to, for example, start working with an internationally focused network of organizations like the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, or to connect and share common language with private sector, with public sector, and with academia, which is again something that we haven't experienced in the past. And as I mentioned, it also creates a common language that allows organizations in Canada to connect and share in a meaningful way with organizations that are doing work outside of our borders. And this is something that's really quite exciting and exceptional, and really creates opportunities to develop a more robust partnership ecosystem in Canada. And so that's another reason we're quite excited. And the last thing I'll hit on is that this is really a robust data framework. And so again, what this allows us to do, and we've seen many examples, whether that's through Community Foundation program like Vital Signs or through the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, that a lot of these regional, national, and international indicator frameworks are mapping their indicators and their impact measurement systems to the SDGs. So in the same way that we can speak a common language that allows us to develop partnerships, we can also really see and understand our local level impact and see how it rolls up into a national story or an international story. And the last thing I'll just share about the data framework that we're really excited about is, unlike other previous, whether it's UN or international agenda like the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs really demands that we think about data at a disaggregated level. And what I mean by that is that the tagline of the SDGs is "Leave no one behind." And really through rose-colored glasses, we've often seen a picture portrayed of Canada that puts us at the top of many of these indicators, whether it's around economic prosperity, health and well-being, livability. But we know that in so many respects, we're failing specific communities and specific populations in Canada, whether that's failing to address access to clean water in Indigenous communities, or understanding gender disparity in this country. The SDGs really demands that we look at all data at a disaggregated level. And if we fail one group, we fail to meet these goals. Yeah. And so I think that that's a really important departure from a lot of the agendas that we perhaps have looked at or worked within in the past. Yeah. And many other reasons, and I'm sure we'll unpack them on this discussion, but I'll leave it there.
All right, thanks, Jaypee. Why don't I go to you, Eugene, and let's hear a little bit about impact investment and how this fits in with the SDGs. Oh, you may be on mute still. There we go.
How's that?
Very good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak to this webinar. I think it's a great initiative that BCCIC is leading here, and I think in many ways you're probably the leading Council for International Cooperation across the country on this area, so that's great. I'm Eugene Ellman. I'm National Director for Canada for Oiko Credit. Just to give you a few words on what Oiko Credit is before I get into the SDGs. Oiko Credit is an international development fund that was started about 40 years ago. It was started by the World Council of Churches as a way to mobilize assets of the churches and other organizations, like-minded organizations, for international development in a way that would not contribute to the Vietnam War and wouldn't contribute to apartheid. So it was established in 1975. We've been going a little over 40 years. In those 40 years, we've reached assets of over €1 billion. We're up around 1.2 billion euros now. And our mandate really is to raise money in investment capital, not donations, not charitable funding, but to raise investment money in Europe and North America to provide loans and investments to partner organizations in the developing world. So our primary business is microfinance. About 80% of our portfolio is in microfinance and financial inclusion, but we're also involved in sustainable agriculture and renewable energy as well. And I think I'm just going to try and share a screen with you here. Hopefully this will work. Okay, is that up?
Not yet, no. Keep trying. So you'll hit share screen. There we go. We've just got it now.
Okay, is that it?
Yeah, we've got you.
Okay, good. So, yeah, so we did a mapping exercise in 2016 against the SDGs, and we basically found that our activities contribute to almost all of the SDGs in one way or another. But in particular, there are 5 SDGs that are really key to what we do. So as I mentioned, our key activity is providing loans and investments to the financial inclusion sector. So that includes microfinance, microinsurance, and savings institutions such as savings and credit cooperatives around the world. We invest in more than 500 of these around the world. And in our mapping exercise, what we found was that financial inclusion it speaks very centrally to goal number 1, obviously no poverty, because by bringing financial inclusion to communities and to people that don't have access to banking services or financial services right now, you provide credit and levels of finance that even out the ups and downs of poverty and provide, and in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, provide capital to set up micro-entrepreneurships. Gender equality is very central to this as well. We have done surveys of our microfinance institutions, and we find that 86% of the clients of our partner institutions are women. So this speaks very centrally to goal number 5. And of course, decent work and economic growth. I mean, the whole point of providing capital to impoverished communities is to raise them out of poverty and to create economic opportunity in ways that wouldn't be available otherwise. Our second main sector is sustainable agriculture. We invest in worker cooperatives, fair trade organizations, farmer service organizations to create new markets for smallholder farmers and to increase their productivity. So obviously this is part of, again, no poverty. We have a priority to serve smallholder farmers in rural communities. But of course, this also speaks very strongly to zero hunger. because the smallholder farmers make up the bulk of agricultural production in the developing world. And by bolstering this, by financing organizations that support smallholder farmers, you're able to not just increase their incomes, but also to increase their own food security. And thirdly, we have renewable energy. We are invested in a number of larger renewable energy projects around the world, run-of-river hydro projects, and wind projects. But our real key there is off-grid solar and village-based energy projects that are bringing electricity and light and other infrastructure, other electricity-based infrastructure to villages that are not now connected to the grid. So we believe that these 5 goals are central to what we do. Our future ambition, I'll talk maybe a little bit about this later in the discussion, is to work with partners and bring in other organizations, foundations, NGOs, governments, other entities that can create a larger partnership to increase our ability to achieve social impact for these partner organizations that we deal with. And we think that in many ways this is going to speak to the work of the SDGs going forward.
Super. You know, Eugene, I'm going to have to get you to remember to turn your screen off. And
right.
Then move to Stephen. And Stephen, I'm going to ask you the exact same question, just a bit of background on McConnell and how you're involved in the SDGs before we move on with some of that deeper questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And again, echoing Eugene's comments, I really appreciate BCCIE's leadership in this space and the opportunity to speak today. So at McConnell Foundation, you know, we're a national private foundation, so operating philanthropically, but also as impact investors. So we kind of parallel or bridge the work of Jaypee and Eugene. And I'll just see if I can throw up a visual here to show you how we're looking at the SDGs. Can you see this?
We see Stephen's iPad right now. So if you go to maybe open up a screen or a photo, or does it say?
Yeah, I've got a slide open, says funding and investing in the SDGs in Canada at the McConnell Foundation.
Okay, all I'm seeing right now is Stephen's iPad.
Okay, well, let's try. See if I can share this. No, all right. Well, let's move on. But just to say, we took the SDG framework and we're in the process of integrating it into a way of looking at our own work. So as a national funder, working across a range of issues, environmental, social, cultural, we're looking at the SDGs as a way of describing to ourselves and our board what it is we're doing and what we want to be accountable for. So in each of the 17 goal areas we've identified, I've gone down the level to the targets and mapped our current initiatives against those so that we can report across them to, as I say, various stakeholders, our grantee partners, other funders that we work with. This is a way of orienting our work, I think, to have it contribute to others' work in this space. And from the McConnell perspective, this is the opportunity that I think the SDGs give us is to, in contrast to the Millennium Development Goals, which are about the developing world, these goals actually apply to the West just as much. This is about all of us coming together to achieve the necessary transition to a sustainable and inclusive state on the planet. So that universal nature of the goals leads us further to talk about cross-sectoral partnerships. You mentioned the enormous capital gap in this space, and so we're using our granting to create the conditions for impact investments that we hope demonstrate the viability and the opportunity to invest much larger amounts of capital into the transition to a low carbon economy, into indigenous reconciliation, things like home building on reserves. There are many challenges that the philanthropic sector and our partners, the CBOs as you call them, work on, that we're pointing out solutions, we're creating opportunities for people to come together. But if we really want to move the needle towards an SDG, we have to bring other forms of capital, like the work that Eugene's doing and that some community foundations are doing as well. So I think that's the big opportunity and the call that we feel in philanthropy. For McConnell, this is an opportunity to be a kind of ecosystem player. We span the private, public, and philanthropic sectors in our work, and the SDGs give us a framework to use to talk to people about why it's important to collaborate, why we can't just be grant makers as philanthropic organizations. I think we have to be using our convening power, our relational capital, and our capital, our endowments, to really commit to what is such an important global effort at an important time.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because all three of you have talked about the usefulness of it as an overall rubric. Eugene, you kind of zoomed in on some of the key goals. And Jaypee, you talked about it being a universal language and so on. And one of the questions I have is, in the sector as a whole, in the sort of the foundation sector, the financing sector, what are some of the gaps and opportunities? We don't have that much time to 2030, so we have to be very strategic. And obviously, you must be thinking the same thing. Where are the strategic fulcrums of change that you as funders or people can put your money or find places to do impact investment? And I'm wondering what those are. What do you see as the gaps and the best opportunities in the coming years here? Why don't we start, and we'll start the other side again, Jaypee, and give you a chance to jump in here again.
Yeah, sure. I'll speak first at a macro level to some of the gaps. So again, we're about 2.5 years into this 15-year agenda. And we know that the UN has estimated that we need about $3.9 trillion a year, every year leading up to 2030 to meet these goals uniformly around the world. They've also estimated that we currently have a 2.5 of $3.9 trillion funding gap. And so really right now, while the SDGs presents a wealth of opportunities, and I hit on a couple of those from the standpoint of how we're viewing them here in Canada, I think Stephen really hit the nail on the head when he suggested that this is really an opportunity to break down some of these barriers and foster much more meaningful intersector or intersectoral partnerships to really address some of these financing gaps. So again, from philanthropy's perspective, I think there are fantastic organizations that are really helping at a community level to move the needle on many of these SDGs. Organizations need to continue to support and increase their support for those organizations, because that's really going to help Canada meet its goals and its objectives under this international agenda. But this is as much about creating new investment vehicles, responsible investment vehicles, understanding the ways in which we can create a more conducive policy and regulatory space for impact investing, to encourage VCs to support programs that are working towards some of these goals, to understand some of the ways in which we can move beyond just basic responsible investing with institutional investors to perhaps SDG-aligned investing. There are some really good examples internationally that are starting to come to fruition that will create the types of financing vehicles we need to help close that gap. But it really is for all three sectors plus to put their heads together and come up with some new solutions that aren't just bilateral funding, multilateral funding, philanthropic grant making, et cetera.
Eugene, do you think that you three are atypical of the sector in terms of the common understanding that you seem to have about the core concepts of the SDGs?
No, I don't think we are typical. I think we're actually probably further along than most people in the investment industry. But the investment industry is coming along slowly but surely. MSCI, which is a large global financial information company, has started an SDG investment index, which I think is a great idea. It invests in companies that have at least 50% of their production in some way oriented towards the SDGs. So I think that's a great public sector initiative. But as Jaypee said, 2.5 trillion a year for the next 12 or 13 years is a mind-boggling amount of money. and it's going to require all kinds of different initiatives, hundreds and hundreds of initiatives from different locations. So some of it will include, very large infrastructural investments by major institutional investors like pension funds, but some of it's also going to be more community focused and development focused, like the work that the three of us do. So there's a new concept that's been coming along over the last few years called blended finance. And there's a blended finance task force which is looking into this concept. And basically, in a nutshell, what it means is that ways that you can bring public sources of capital like the multilateral development banks or development finance institutions supported by governments, together with philanthropic organizations, charities, foundations, NGOs, and private sector lenders to create a package of services that can really demonstrate significant social impact on the ground in particular partnerships. So Oikocredit is relatively new to this area, but we have done a few of these in the past. The one that I think we're most proud of right now is something called our Coffee Price Risk Management Program to address the issue of the price risk of facing the coffee industry. So price risk is the single greatest risk facing producers in coffee producing countries. So we partnered with, we brought together a number of interesting partners, some of whom have background in this area, some of whom don't. Inter-American Development Bank obviously has background in this. A company called Keurig Green Mountain Coffee, you may be familiar with them. Fairtrade USA, and Catholic Relief Services, which is a humanitarian organization. And we brought them together to fund a program that will work with coffee co-ops and other producer organizations to work directly with producers on issues like inventory management and hedging that will reduce that price risk over time. We are aiming to, at the end of the day, deal with about 5,000 producers in various countries around the world. And at the end of the day, reduce that risk and increase investors' or producers' incomes substantially as a result. And I think this would speak to all sorts of the SDGs. The obviously number one, no poverty, but as well as decent economic conditions. So.
No, that's fascinating. In fact, I know that Fairtrade Canada is having their national conference this weekend, and the SDGs are a major part of what they're talking about right now. So that's really taken off in the fair trade movement. Stephen, why don't we jump to you, and I can ask you the same question. Do you think that you're typical of the private foundations out there in terms of orienting towards the SDGs or trying to work with this as a rubric, as well as the other question about the gap?
Yeah, well, I wish we were, I hope we're typical or we become more typical. I really appreciate the conversation that Community Foundations of Canada is leading in Canada. We're very aligned there, but I think we've got, through our associations like the Canadian Environmental Grant Makers Network and Philanthropic Foundation of Canada, Imagine Canada, we've got more work to do, I think, to shape the narrative, which is, I think, the first gap, is that there's the narrative gap. Enough of us have heard about it, but it's not being as powerfully expressed, reported on, and shared in communities and across the community sector, but also in the private and public sector. So I think we've got a big gap there. If we want to mobilize that our contribution to the 2.9 trillion, we have to get more people thinking and talking about it. And that implies, I think, building on the work that the Jaypee was talking about, the community foundations are doing around metrics. The community the level of, community needs to understand these metrics and be able to get a hold of them. The vital signs report that Community Foundations produces across Canada is a good example, and I think that's one way to get at this. But it's also important for the kind of work that Eugene does to have in metrics that are understandable by investors. So we've got some more work to do there. That's a gap. But I think that there's a broader one here about that. If we think this is about all sectors coming together, I think there's some learning to do, some capacity building around what it takes to actually work across sectors effectively. So we're pretty good at marshaling our own communities, our own forces. Yeah. But then when it comes time to sit down with the private sector guys, like they look at us, like, oh, here come the, the fluffy do-gooders. And, we have to be able to get past that and past our perception of them as the sort of the rapacious capitalist, whatever, to really get to a more robust generative space around the collaboration that's necessary to advance these goals. I think that's the reason to do it, but I don't think we're very good at it yet. I think there's real work to be done there. So that capacity building and orientation piece, I think, is really important. And then I would just end with the notion of knowledge mobilization. So we are, I'm learning so much about Whitecoat credit today. I have to say, I wish I'd known more sooner, but the knowledge about what's working and where and how different people in different places are advancing on the SDGs is a big missing capacity. Without that, we end up kind of repeating or going around in circles or unnecessarily duplicating. So I think there's some important gaps to address while we also focus on actually moving the needle on the SDGs themselves.
Well, let's talk about that narrative for a minute, because I find that particularly interesting, particularly where the rest of these questions go, which is really about crossing that cultural boundary between maybe civil society and funders, or even funders, civil society, and government and the private. They're very different cultures. You're absolutely correct when we bring them together. And I wonder, what do you feel what is the most poignant or best way for us in the future here to have that sort of generative space? I'm really intrigued by that idea.
Is that for me to answer?
Yeah, you're on generative space. I'm going to challenge you.
And I think so. There's actually, you love it when in our business, you love it when you can solve, two problems at once. We're going through in Canada and indeed around the world, particularly in the States, kind of crisis in the space of democratic discourse and reliable reporting on what matters. A lot of the media and social media are focused on trivial or non-relevant issues. Our attention is constantly pulled away to things that are interesting or give us a quick dopamine rush, but they're not really where we should be focusing. So in that space, the emergence of something called solutions journalism, I think, is worth a look. It's a Canadian, David Bornstein, who's written about social change movements around the world, is a New York Times columnist. He writes the Fixes column about solutions to tough problems. And he's created the Solutions Journalism Network, based in New York, but now going global without any Canadian participation. And it's about providing rigorous reporting on people's efforts to solve tough problems. And not surprisingly, it's full of interesting material. It generates higher levels of readership and reader loyalty. People want to follow the story of, well, how are they working on that homeless problem in Kamloops or whatever, or what are they going to do about the child welfare issue in Winnipeg? So it's a practice that I think we can work together to bring to Canada. I know community foundations are thinking about this. We are. We're going to need some regulatory relief from CRA around philanthropic participation in media, and I think we can try and fill that gap in the local media, because we're losing hundreds and hundreds of local media platforms right now because the advertising dollars are going south. So we've got to solve that, and I think we can bring a solutions journalism focus to that effort.
Okay, Jaypee, you're next on my screen, and I'm going to jump to community foundations because Stephen just mentioned it. And what I'm curious about here is, you mentioned the idea of scales, that the community foundations work at the local scale. This is somewhat seen as an international, but also a universal scale issue. And I'm curious about that. How do we create a generative space around this local and international? How do the community because you seem to have done a really good job of it with the community foundations and the Vital Signs program and Universality.
And sorry, the question specifically.
The question specifically is what do you see as the gap that's needed to be filled for community foundations? Given that you're working with this scales question, I'm really curious. Where do you think you need to go, or where does the community foundations? I don't want to call it sector or movement, but where do you need to go in the future here for the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd reflect a little bit on our journey, as I mentioned, over the last 25 years, at really understanding what it meant for community foundations that were place-based and focused on really addressing issues at a local level using local leadership, knowledge, financial assets, et cetera. and what it's meant for us to try to think about our work as building a community foundation movement, and what that has unlocked from the standpoint of taking something that is inherently locally rooted and really connecting it and building something that is greater than the sum of its individual parts. And so I think over the last number of years, we've really seen a couple of really tangible proof points of what it's meant for individual community foundations to take that local knowledge, local leadership, et cetera, really drive local solutions towards some of these very pressing challenges, again, in their communities, but to share that, to add scale, to work collaboratively with one another. And in the case of the community foundation movement, for example, to also then be able to leverage all of that, all of those local resources to foster scaled up partnerships, whether that's with federal government, whether that's with the private sector. You know, Stephen mentioned, you know, we love it when we can solve two problems at one time. And I think the thing that is interesting about the SDGs, I think really it is as much as it's an international and a universal agenda, it's also very much a local agenda, is that it's not only going to force us to change how we think about specific issues, but also how we work with one another, and how we can really meaningfully connect that local and that global narrative. I spent a number of years working in international development before coming into a kind of domestic focus space here in Canada. And I know Stephen mentioned solutions journalism, and if I can throw a nod out to another space where I would recommend people take a look, there's probably 25, 30 years of really good literature and practices on how to build cross-sectoral partnerships out there. This is something that's been out in the development community for so long. And when I think about just one of the very specific benefits that local organizations can take from plugging into this global space, is that when I re-entered the sector in Canada, I actually felt like we were 15 or 20 years behind in our understanding about what it means to work cross-sectorally from a shared values lens, not just to transact across sectors, but to really meaningfully bring public, private, and nonprofit sectors together. There's exceptional examples out there. There's practices, there's downloadable resources, and there's decades of it. And so I think as much as this is an opportunity for us to advance some of the work we're doing at a local level, it's also an opportunity for us to plug into what the rest of the world is doing and to learn from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Eugene, you mentioned 2.5, I think it was trillion you said every year, right? And I remember looking that up in terms of comparing that to a military budget. It didn't seem like such a big money. Yeah, right. In terms of where people do invest their money, though, in life, and you are obviously trying to switch that investment world around and change its focus. And I'm curious, what do you think are some of the key opportunities? I mean, you mentioned renewable energies and so on, but what do you see in the bigger picture of the investment world? Will they accept this SDG agenda?
Yeah, I think they are. There's some interesting research work that's going on now among institutional investment managers on this. And interestingly, Canada is one of the leaders in this area because the Canadian government has formed a partnership with the World Economic Forum to establish a new program called Convergence Finance. And Convergence Finance is based in Toronto. It's got a modest staff, not a huge budget, but they're in the process of mapping out a lot of these interesting blended finance models now that are coming up in the world. So I think one of the things we need to do is this mapping exercise to see what interesting models are being put forward there. But I think another just practical thing that we could do as the investment sector, the socially responsible investment sector, mainstream sector, community foundations, international development foundations, and private foundations, is to just attend. All of us should attend more and more of our conferences and convenings, so that we kind of break out of these silos that have prevented us from thinking about the SDGs or about world challenges in a more holistic way. So the price risk management program that I talked about earlier was really what got it going was some of our staff on our sustainable agriculture side starting to attend coffee conferences around the world and just talking to suppliers, buyers, nonprofit funders that are interested in coffee as a poverty issue, and then through that we were able to come together with this interesting collaboration.
So I'm just thinking that I want to go to the questions that are coming up on the chat group. But before I do, obviously many of the people on this call are CSOs or people that work, and they look to funders for that funding all the time. And I don't want that to be the focus of the conversation, but I am curious, when CSOs want to work with funders that are oriented toward the SDGs, how do you expect that you'll be bringing in these SDGs into your funding frameworks or your investment portfolios? In what way should they be looking at you guys to try to understand the new game or the new narrative? Mm-hmm. And why don't I start, Jaypee, you're at the bottom, so I'll start with you.
Okay, good.
Of my list here. It's no particular order here, you guys.
Again, I'll echo a statement I made earlier that I really hope that the SDGs don't represent this new barrier to entry for us to collaborate more meaningfully with one another. There's no shortage of new lingo and frameworks. And so, I mean, the development industry has been built on this for decades of launching new agendas every so often. And it requires not only funders, but more importantly, requires local organizations to fundamentally shift how they think and talk and do the work that they're doing. And at the end of the day, I really hope that as this agenda starts to land in Canada, we're very sensitive to the fact that there are organizations that are doing incredible work that quite clearly fits within the SDGs, and that if we are going to, as funders, require individual organizations to understand specifically how they fit in, that we also really do the meaningful legwork to build capacity and create learning opportunities so organizations can plug into that. But I think more importantly, there's a role for community foundations, for private foundations and so forth to play the role of translator. Right. I think this is something that the federal government has decided to voluntarily report on at the High Level Political Forum this year. There is incredible work being done in communities across the country, and perhaps it's actually the funders' role to understand what's going on locally and how that fits, and then to translate that into something that plugs into a regional, national, and international story. So I think we need to do more capacity building work and create learning opportunities so people can plug in. But really the SDGs is about connecting and amplifying great work that's already taking place and adding scale to it. It really shouldn't be a framework that adds an additional burden to the work that community organizations are doing.
I'll come back to that scales thing in a minute, because that's one of the questions coming up in our chat box. But Stephen, maybe I'll ask you the same question around the funding, where people could look to you from the CSO sector.
Yeah, and I think we partner. Of course, we're in a partnership relationship with sector leaders and practitioners, and so some of the things that I think are moving the field. First of all, there's the metrics piece. How can we contribute to rolling up our data together so that we're able to account to donors and the public sector, other partners, that we're moving on a particular SDG. So it's a useful framework for the SDG, gives us the framework to talk to funders in public and private sectors. So we're not just telling the story, although that's important. We're also able to document with some quantifiable, some data. So that's a piece that I think is important here. And I think that the other is that, our sector is very big in Canada and diverse, and that's a strength. But there are opportunities, we think, to align efforts around sort of at a domain level. So if we're working on a particular sustainability issue or a community issue, this is an opportunity to come together with those people that you would have formerly seen as your competition and say, let's align forces here, and that's going to really be noticed by funders. Funders are doing it. I'm here in Banff at a meeting of the Clean Economy Fund, which is currently about 10 foundations looking at aligning their efforts around funding the transition to a low carbon economy. There's 6 other foundations here kicking the tires to see whether they want to join us. But we, in the funder space, see that to get to the scale we need around these issues, and with the diversity of approaches that's important, we have to start collaborating in different ways. So I think that applies to the people we support as well as to us.
Yeah, we're seeing that coming up in the chat box right now, this idea of how do some of the smaller efforts, the smaller micro organizations fit in when many of the funding frameworks are very large, and maybe bundling is one of those solutions. People have to just work in more alliances.
And I would just add that this is not to say that everything has to be big to be good. We're also, I think, really needing to make sure that this stuff pushes out past the usual grantees out to communities and remote, people in remote and rural communities, for example, with an invitation to participate. This is an opportunity to look at, the kind of the infrastructure that we're using to get things done. So we're having a conversation with universities and colleges, for example, about the role that they play in building social infrastructure. There are organizations like the Small Change Fund that are pushing past the reach of traditional philanthropy to get out to rural and remote communities. There's a lot to do, and I think in that sense, the practices of social R&D become important. It's like we don't have all the answers. We have a lot of them, but there's still big questions, and fostering community level experiments that are well designed and able to share the results is a big part of the work that I think we want to be doing with grantees and other partners at this point.
Eugene, Oikocredit is, essentially you've mastered this because you've been working with these very microcredit kind of scale investments, and yet you're investing with very large sums of money. What do you think what do you have to say to CSOs around the scales question of how to get involved when some of their projects are so small?
Yeah, I want to echo what Stephen just said, that you don't have to be, just because you're small doesn't mean that you're not important. And I think it's, especially in the international development context, it's really important to keep in mind that we're here because of those local communities in the developing world. And we have to keep their needs first and foremost. So in designing these projects, I think it's really important to have your eyes and ears on the ground in those local communities in developing countries, and to solve the problems as they define them, as they see them. Because we can, here in the north of the world, we can design these fantastic frameworks that will be, tied to the SDGs and bring us closer to these ambitious goals of 2030. But if we're not really meeting the average everyday needs of partner organizations in the developing world, then there's really no point in doing it. So I think we just got to keep our heart and our head close to those local communities.
Yeah. So, well, before I let you off the hook there, in a sense, how does the investment globally work? Because you work in a Canadian, my understanding is you work in a kind of a Canadian context for investment, right? But then what are the pressures when it comes to jumping up a scale? We just talked about jumping down a scale to meet the local needs, but what happens when we get into the international investment community?
Right. Okay. So one of the big issues is return. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Risk and return. So Oikocredit basically deals with what we call concessionary investors. Our traditional return has been somewhere between 0 and 2%. And for our investors, our socially motivated investors, that's okay. That's a worthwhile return because they have the satisfaction of knowing that they're achieving good social impact through it. But when you talk about larger investors, even foundations that have certain criteria, certain return expectations that they have to meet, those concessionary returns are not going to be good enough. So one of the things that Convergence is looking at now is figuring out ways that you can bring other players to bear, where if you can get multilateral development banks or philanthropic organizations to take some of the risk out of that investment, then you'll attract more mainstream investors to it, either by generating higher returns or by lowering the risk.
Is that the role of government? Is that the role of government in that?
Possibly. Yes.
Because we've seen that with the federal government's, I can't remember what they're calling it, but it's their blended finance model around trying to take away the risk of it.
Yeah, and FinDev Canada, which has just been started, that could be, but it doesn't have to be restricted to government. Any non-market player can come in with some sort of a contribution, and if that can be organized in a way to take some of the risk out of it, then that's going to widen the pool of investors that can be attracted, and that's ultimately what we want to do.
Jaypee, can I ask on let's just go to risk for a second here, because is it risky to be associated with the SDGs from the Community Foundation's perspective? Does it look like mission drift, that you're moving way beyond the local community?
I don't think so at all, to be honest. I mean, from our standpoint, this is really about taking the work that community foundations are, in many respects, already supporting. So the work of those small local organizations in communities, really in every corner of the country, urban, rural, et cetera, and helping to really translate that work so that it plugs into this international agenda. So from our perspective, while there's very much a top-down lens that you could use to look at the SDGs, we're really looking at this as an opportunity to foster greater connection, collaboration, partnership, and sharing of some of those best practices really at that local level. So for us, it's a highly effective tool, and even more so effective because of that top-down level that's encouraging large corporations to come on board and start aligning their efforts around the SDGs. It's encouraging large private foundations to get involved, et cetera. It really creates an environment in which we can, again, speak a common language, tap into shared measurement systems, share best practices, which is highly valuable from a local community perspective. And there's so much coming out of communities, small and large, that should be shared and that can be learned from other communities.
Stephen, this idea of sharing a common language, are we seeing the really big foundations? I'm thinking like something Bill and the Gates Foundation. I mean, are they grabbing this SDG agenda in the same way that you are? Do you think that they have the same view that collaboration is the way forward here?
Yeah, before I answer that, I'd like to just speak a little bit about the risk question. I think there's an important point to be made here. Going back to what Eugene was saying about the efforts to move more capital into the space, it's good to remember that foundations actually have this pool of capital around which they expect zero return. Not 0%, not just get your money back, but get no money back.
Right.
And that's a really important contribution to be able to make to engage in the exploration of new possibilities and essentially de-risking the space so that more patient capital investors like the Equal Credit can come in and say, okay, well, you've prepared the ground here. We can come in with a 0 or 2% loan, and we do that as well. But I think that's the opportunity space here that we just don't have enough happening in that space. It's one of the reasons why there's a federal consultation on social innovation and social finance going on right now, hosted by ESDC, and which I'm one of 17 members of. And this is one of the questions we're looking at there, is how do we orient civil society and public sector commitments to the SDGs? Yeah. How do we finance that? How do we do the capacity building that's necessary and create the means by which more capital can flow into solving these solutions with community partners, private sector and the public sector. And then around the collaboration narrative, it's absolutely top of the agenda. I note that just 6 months ago, something called Co-Impact was formed in London with Gates and Oak. There's a number of other foundations looking at the absolute necessity to collaborate around moving big agendas. We are seeing that in Canadian philanthropy. There's more work. I know Community Foundations of Canada just convened their counterparts in the US and Mexico, and maybe Jaypee would speak to that. But increasingly, I think foundations are seeing that we have no choice, if we want to make a difference, to partner extensively and to learn how to do that really well very quickly.
Excellent. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, so why don't we jump straight to that? Do any of you have any points of collaboration you'd like to point out before I do at the end of this commentary here, or any last comments? Why don't we start with Jaypee here at the bottom? So I'll jump to you right there and we'll go up.
Always my screen. Yes. No, I mean, as I shared, we've spent the last year going across the country. Many of our foundations, let alone the organizations with whom we're working, are actually incredibly small, volunteer-run organizations. And so we've been quite cautious when I say a year and a half. I mean, we've truly been meeting with not only our members, but hundreds of organizations across the country to really get a sense of what, for example, what Community Foundations of Canada's role might be, but also how the SDGs are landing in community. And I really started off with the hypothesis that we might have to play the role as translator. Really understand what's exciting and what's happening at a community level, and to be able to at least share that story, both from a data perspective and from a communications perspective, with some of those large organizations that are really helping to drive the agenda around the SDGs in Canada and globally. But what I've heard is actually quite the opposite, that these are goals that resonate, that small organizations and large organizations feel connected to. The narrative that this common language, that this shared measurement system, though we have a lot of work to get there, are possible, again, resonate quite well. And we've seen not only many of our own members from community foundations, both large and small, kind of put their hand up and actually beat us to the punch on this narrative. But we've heard from hundreds of organizations across the country that, and I know BCCIC's report not only echoes this, but is probably the spot to look, that said, well, we've been working on this, we've been thinking about it, we didn't realize you were. And so this is kind of here, and there's a lot of energy and a lot of momentum around it. And while there's certainly challenges with respect to financing gaps, with respect to capacity building, we're in 2018, we've got till 2030. We don't have to get everything done in the next couple of weeks, but there's an energy and a momentum that I haven't seen collectively emerge in Canada really ever before. And so we should ride that wave.
Yeah, ride the wave, exactly. Eugene.
Yeah, I would agree that there's an energy and a momentum here that is really important and is motivating this getting out of the silo mentality that has kept us apart for so many years. One thing that we're thinking about in Oikocredit, though, is that we have done a strategic review in the last year, and we have come to the conclusion that we have been trying to do too many things with too few resources. So we are going to double down on those three key strategies of financial inclusion, sustainable agriculture, and renewable energy. And what we're going to do is we're going to look for people in the philanthropic space, in the multilateral development bank space, with interests in those three areas, and then try and start some conversations where we can build these packages that will have increase our social impact around the world.
Super. Stephen, you jumped to the bottom, but now you're on the top of my list.
Okay. Well, I want to just maybe touch on a couple things that we haven't talked about very much today. And the first one would be Indigenous reconciliation. It's not a specific NDG. You have to kind of hunt for it, but it's such an important cultural shift going on in Canada right now that we almost have to, weave it in, or we do have to weave it in. I'm saying it because it's one where a lot of SDGs are touching, but I think we need an explicit conversation about that. And then I just want to look at SDGs number 16 and 17, partnership and governance. And these are areas where I think we've got some really interesting work to do in Canada that may well be of use to people not only inside the country, but outside our borders. We're a country that is reasonably well governed, and governance innovation is something that I think we can develop further strength around when it comes to watershed level governance or ecosystem governance for to produce higher levels of equality or to produce inequality. There's a number of places where I think we've got some real strengths that we could be building on. There are 3 experiments in the country right now on a guaranteed annual income and so on. So just to say, I think there's more to this than currently meets the eye. There's some things that we can be looking for opportunities to lead over the next dozen years or so. And then I don't want to leave without mentioning the role of the education system in enabling us to raise a generation that is oriented towards these goals. I think we're seeing all around us young people who are so committed to solving tough challenges in our organization, right across our sector. There's just like so many young people who want to make a difference. So that's great, but how do we build on that to raise a generation of generations that are steeped in this knowledge of what our goals are and are given opportunities to work on those directly in their education as they're educated to take meaningful action in their communities and on issues that are important to them. So that implies a certain orientation in our education system that I think we should be spending more time talking about.
In fact, it's a good way to sum up our conversation, because at the end of the day, like the way we've talked about this at BCCIC more and more is that the SDGs are a wicked problem in the sense that they cannot be solved by any single group or individual. You can't just say, here, youth, go and solve this problem, or you funders go and solve this, or government go and solve this. This requires this collaborative thinking in a world where we don't even know the answers to how to solve it. So we actually have to collaborate and think more openly and have the kind of conversations that we're having today. And yet at the same time, we still have to drill down to the real world problems. Like we're trying to get 25 youth to the HLPF in July. How do we do it? How do we actually technically get them there? And that's a small question, but unless you can answer that, you can't make broad statements about youth. So we have that same challenge, right? Boils down to the details.
absolutely. This is a new intergenerational conversation that we should be having and supporting, and that notion of intergenerational equity, I think, is part of this. And let's also just say that I hope this is the last time that I'm on a all-white, all
yeah, I noticed it too.
Yeah,
that's very noticeable.
Okay?
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. The good news is that this is not our last conversation. This was meant to give a flavor for all three of you who sit in very influential positions in terms of working with the SDGs and working with financing and impact investment and foundations and community foundations and so on. But there are some excellent conversations coming up in the next few months, and many of which are actually oriented directly at youth. For example, we have a youth boot camp coming up in which we hope to get these 25 youth to the HLPF and have them there in actual real positions, being able to speak to the subject of the SDGs in an informed manner. We have the Community Foundations meeting, which we're co-sponsoring on March the 23rd, Friday, March the 23rd in Vancouver. And I would invite anybody who's on this call to check our website or check with Dan afterwards. And I know that all three of you also have websites and ways to, you can stay in contact with people if there are. The conversation needs to keep going. It's something we hope to keep promoting at BCCIC. And I certainly hope this isn't the last time that we get into a conversation in which I feel like we just started, because that's how I feel right now. I feel like we just got into some major subjects, and there's so much more to talk about.
Thanks, Michael.
So thank you very much to all three of you. And thank you, Jerry.
Mike,
do you need to chip in here?
I do chip in because we do still have a few minutes left for questions and answers from.
Oh, we do? I thought we had to quit.
No, we go to 1:30, so we have an extra half an hour, so we can we can take a few questions from the chat box there. Would you like me just to read them out?
Yeah. Do you want to read one out? Sure.
Sure.
I can't see it for some reason, Dan. I don't know why. But
popping up over there. That's okay.
It's not popping up.
Well, I'll just field some of the questions, and as we do have this time left for questions and answers. Just start.
Before we do, can I just wait a second? Can I just riff off that last thing, because I think there's just something here. Do these three guys? Do you think that it is a wicked problem? Do you think it's a solvable problem, or do you, in the sense that do you think the answers are out there, or do you think we still have to figure this out? I mean, I'm curious about that from your position. Do you think everything is that we need to know to get to Agenda 2030 is known at this point? We just have to put it together, or is it still an unsolved thing? You know what I'm talking about by a wicked problem? The idea with a wicked problem is that nobody actually knows the answer. And so you could go to you can't find an expert who's going to give it to you. You guys couldn't go and find an organization that knows how to tackle the SDGs. It's an unknown. This is what people talked about, an unknown unknown. It's not knowable. So how do we actually solve something that we can't figure out because it's so complex? I'm stumping you. So.
Maybe
any one of you.
We do know a lot. And that's important to be able to harvest that and disseminate it quickly, as I was saying earlier. So the notion of a what work center that gathers what we know about a particular issue, synthesizes it, translates it into accessible language for activists, practitioners, policymakers, educators, investors, and so on is an important piece of social infrastructure that's starting to appear in the UK and the US, and see some emerging here. But as wicked problems continue to change shape, we can't say, okay, the job's done. We have to keep working at it. And so, it is an ongoing effort. But if there's an overarching goal of transitioning in 12 years, then, we need everything we know, and we also need to design smart social R&D to explore and experiment to find solutions to those things that we don't yet know.
Mm-hmm.
Goal 17 of the SDGs is partnerships, and I think that in its very existence as the only sort of non-issue goal recognizes the fact that there is no single organization or group of organizations that could know everything we need to know to solve these problems. I think it's going to, as I mentioned, require us to all fundamentally change a little bit about how we work, and so as we need to collaborate better and work better with one another across sectors, locally, globally, et cetera. And so I think for local community organizations to continue to do what they're doing, to improve what they're doing, to work towards these goals, that's a very important part of it. And it's for other organizations to figure out other very important parts. As long as we're connecting and building that partnership ecosystem, we'll be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, if I can just chime in here, I think it's more of a question of faith rather than scientific knowledge on this point. But my faith is that between all of the knowledge that we have in the investment sector, in the foundation sector, in the development sector, that the knowledge is in the room. We just have to get the people together in the room at the same time and talking to each other to figure out how to apply this existing knowledge to the problems.
Dan, you're going to have to advise me. I've got some very technical questions. I'll try them out on you guys and see what you think. Could we get an assessment of how many are interested in Goal 3 as a method of going beyond the nation state on universal pharma, dental, and Medicare? So that's a very technical question. Do any of you have ideas on that? A couple of these are fairly... All right, I'm not getting a response to that. Have any of you got any experience in the social economy with worker co-ops? I won't add pharmacology because that's getting very specific, but do you think that the role of cooperatives, perhaps, Oikos, I know you've worked with co-ops and so on.
Yeah.
Is there a role?
We work with quite a number of co-ops, both in the agricultural space, coffee co-ops, cocoa co-ops, banana co-ops. I've been personally to a banana co-op in northern Peru. And on the financial inclusion side, we've also worked with a number of SACCOs, they're called Savings and Credit Cooperatives. We think it's a terrific solution to these problems because with a co-op, inherently there's a democratic decision-making structure. So you inherently bring in the priorities and the needs of the local communities through this. So we think that by encouraging co-ops and strengthening co-ops, that's a big part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Jaypee.
Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, or Co-ops Canada, has done an incredible amount of legwork at really understanding the role that co-ops, credit unions, mutuals, et cetera, in Canada can play in advancing the SDGs. There's actually some fantastic literature you can download from their website. I know that they've got their national conference coming up in June, and similarly, like many of our networks, the SDGs is probably going to be front and center. And there are so many examples of specific credit unions, whether that's Desjardins or the Van City, that are actually taking very tangible steps, working towards both the SDGs specifically, but also creating financing vehicles that can, like foundations, like microfinancing agencies, like institutional investment vehicles, help us close that gap. So there's actually a lot of literature that they've already produced, and there's some really incredible leadership showing up in the co-ops space in Canada.
Stephen, any comments on that?
Yeah, no, just to say, I agree. I think the co-ops and mutuals offer solution space to a lot of what we're doing here, and that we should be paying more attention to them, and we partner with Desjardins. I think a place to look at where this is happening in Canada is in the province of Quebec, which has quite a well-developed social economy with some very innovative financing mechanisms and structures, government procurement policies, and so on, that really make this make Quebec an example to look to.
Maybe I ask you a question because last week, or maybe it was the week before, I was in Ottawa. I can't remember; it's all blur. But basically, I saw a presentation, very interesting one, by a company that was studying whether or not the SDGs, there's any public uptake on the SDGs in Canada. And actually, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta stood out in that. But the overall assessment by the person who made the presentation was that there is not a very good or strong understanding of the SDGs amongst the public in Canada. And so I wonder how that affects your work. Does that impact you?
We're 2 years into a 15-year agenda. Many individuals, I think very few individuals were talking about the Millennium Development Goals at all, but they weren't really talking about them until the very end, when we realized that in most, but not all cases, we failed to meet them. And so the fact that we've already got this incredible momentum, again, that BCCIC has highlighted, that we're starting to experience in communities as well, where individual organizations, maybe not yet individual community members, but individual organizations are really seeing value in this agenda. I think we're way ahead of the game compared to where we've been with previous similar global agendas in the past.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll ask a question here that came up also. It's saying here there could be an initiative with Public Banking Institute. I'm actually not a financial person. I don't know what that is. To enable municipalities to use tax revenue to capitalize on public banks so the governments can borrow internally. Let's just skip to this idea, though. I mean, he's asking, thereby not having to service external debt. Could this allow for more project funding? It's a fairly technical question, but my understanding of it is it's around procurement. This idea of the power of public institutions to be able to procure things using the SDGs as maybe a framework. Is that out there? Do you think in the financial sector there is this power of procurement? Any one of you that feels that you want to comment?
Yeah, well, public sector procurement, first of all, is an underutilized lever for directing capital into solution spaces, into social enterprises, and so on. So I think that makes a lot of sense. If you take an example like the University of Winnipeg, which has set up a community renewal corporation that invests very significantly in low-income housing. It's taken its food service operation away from the American contractor, turned it into a social enterprise that employs about 70 people, the majority of whom face multiple barriers to employment. It's expanding. It's starting to serve other campuses. There's a lot, the public sector expenditure is massive, and directing a significant portion to that to these kinds of social economy solutions is, I think, a really important part of the picture, whether that's depopulating our prisons of healthy young Indigenous guys who would be, a lot happier working on things like home building in the north or geothermal installations. There's a lot of work to be done to transition successfully to a low carbon economy, and that there's just every SDG, there are jobs there waiting to be fulfilled, but our training structures and our institutional arrangements are currently not oriented that way. So we need some big projects at scale that address the child welfare crisis in Manitoba, the housing crisis on reserves, and so on. So that's the opportunity here, and I think the motivation that the SDGs give us is that there's a framework, there's a direction, and there's new partners moving into this space with new money and new ideas. And so I think it's a very exciting time to be doing this work, and history is holding its breath.
Yeah, the power of procurement, I understand, is huge too. When you get, it can be huge sums of money that are involved here. Eugene, you must get this coming.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the question was on procurement or setting up a new kind of institutional bank. I think we've got to be careful about chasing these utopian solutions for things when there are some real grassroots institutions in our own backyards. A few minutes ago we were talking about the credit union system. The credit union system in Canada is fantastic. It's a real alternative to the chartered banks, and in many ways it's leading the discussion on community empowerment. In our own work, we've been able to partner with Van City in British Columbia, with Kindred Credit Union in Ontario, and we have partnerships coming up with two credit unions in Atlantic Canada to figure out a way to bring a global investment product to ordinary average individual investors through those credit union institutions. And it's had a lot of take up, and it's a really kind of innovative solution. So I'd be reluctant to kind of always think we have to design a new thing when really the solutions are right here in our own backyards.
Yeah, in fact, Jaypee, maybe you can comment in the same vein around Alliance 150 and some of the thinking you've had there with the community foundations, because that's not building a new bridge, that's building with a really good one.
Yeah, we've been in the midst of a bit of a process over the last little bit to try to think through how we can leverage some of the infrastructure, whether that's funding, network building, et cetera, that emerged as a result of this kind of moment of Canada 150, this kind of, this kind of fabricated moment that caused us both to think a little bit about our past, but also about where our communities are headed. So much investment was generated last year because of this moment. And one of the opportunities we've been exploring is taking something called Alliance 150, which was really a collaborative initiative that came out of the work of a number of partners many years before 2017 emerged to really ground that narrative in understanding what Canada Sesquicentennial would mean at a community level, and understanding that obviously there were a lot of things to contest as well as to celebrate, and really understanding how we can build stronger alliances between organizations large and small to essentially move the needle on what local community members thought mattered most to their specific community in 2017 versus a kind of larger undertaking. And that Alliance 150 initiative saw 2,500 organizations, many of whom were very small community groups, come together because of this moment last year. We've been reaching out to that network again over the last year and really trying to understand whether there was another type of frame, perhaps like Canada 150, that group would feel close enough to continue the work of fostering stronger collaborations, to continue to produce a vehicle to tell great, very local community level stories of impact, to share examples of what successful initiatives look like. And the SDGs has emerged as something that, again, to my surprise, seems to be the framework that many small organizations are looking to buy into. And so we're really trying to figure out now how we can take a lot of that infrastructure, whether it's media partnerships, whether it's financing vehicles, whether it's public engagement tools that were, again, created to sort of serve the purpose of Canada 150, and I guess re-leverage those toward making meaningful the work of SDGs at the community level.
Yeah. You know, one of the last questions here is just pointing out that this idea of public banks is not a new idea. It goes back to 1919 or so. And a few other people said some of this stuff's not new. And I think one of the questions that I have for you is how much of what you've been doing in the past, prior to the SDGs, is like one of the things we discovered when we did the roundtables is we thought we got to go out there and we have to, kind of convince people to do the SDGs or something. But realistically, people have already been working on women's issues. They're working on poverty. They're working on all these things. It's not a new thing. It's just that it's new in the sense that it's work they've been doing and it's in a new framework, a new narrative, as you say. And I'm curious, how much do you think we need to convince people about the SDGs, or do we just work with them with what they're doing? Or do you think the SDGs are really critical? Like we've got to frame this in the SDG framework as well. Like with the credit unions, for example, many of them do fantastic work. Do they need the SDGs as a framework to keep doing the really great work they're doing? Or what's the added value of the SDGs? I'll start with, I don't know, Stephen, you've been a while since we heard from you. Why don't we start with, you're also on the bottom. I always go to the bottom of my right-hand side. So there you go. You don't want to be there somehow.
Okay. Oh, no, it's good to be at the bottom sometimes. I think it's an important opportunity. I think, first of all, it's millions of people had input into these SDGs. Yeah. It was a very extensive global consultation that produced them. And I think we have a responsibility to be accountable to those voices and to those concerns to this moment, because clearly it's what we've been doing for a long time that has contributed to where we are right now. Although there's been a lot of good done and continues to be done, I think we're now looking at how we can have greater impact and alignment in order to get to impact, because we do have to transition, and that means we all have to learn how to do some things differently that we currently are doing now. So in order to create that sort of permission space for us to talk to each other about how are you changing, or what are you working on, how can we help, what else do you need, I think it's a really good way to be having a conversation that spans sectors, spans generations, and then we can bring to all of the problem areas that we're working on and say, you know what, the world is looking at this issue too. What we do here is important, not only in this context, but we can contribute to and learn from people doing this work in other parts of the world. So it's a powerful narrative, and I think we should be taking it on in order to accentuate and intensify our efforts.
Eugene?
Yeah, I'd agree. Because Oikocredit has been doing poverty work essentially for 40 years, and in various contexts. But the beautiful thing I think about the SDGs is the audaciousness of the ambition of eliminating poverty by the year 2030. And I think that's really there is some skepticism, some cynicism about the SDGs, that among many in the international development community, who see it as just another kind of UN blue washing kind of thing. But I think the majority of people that are involved with Oikocredit actually say this is a fantastic opportunity, and let's mobilize. Let's get behind them, and let's figure out how to accomplish this. And I think a tremendous amount of good will be done as a result of it.
What do you think was the key ingredient when you talk to people in Oikos? What is the key ingredients in the SDGs that give people that boost of enthusiasm or confidence?
I think, well, I wouldn't say it's confidence.
Yeah.
Like I say,
willingness to go along.
Willingness to go along. Yeah. I think just the tremendous ambition of it, taking this age-old problem of poverty and saying, in 2030, it will no longer be the scourge of humankind. So I think that that's for those of us who aren't prone to cynicism. I think that that's a tremendous thing.
Yeah, I've also noticed that the time imperative, it's one of the first times in a document you see language like the last generation with a chance of saving the planet.
Right.
I mean, that one always sticks out for me, that would ever show up in a UN document signed by 193 of the world's leaders. Jaypee, do you have any thoughts on this idea, on this concept?
I think that's exactly it. This isn't business as usual. This has been signed on by every country around the world. This has a concrete timeline, and this requires us to work differently together. And I think that that's the most important piece. We're seeing unusual suspects come out of the woodworks, come to convenings to talk about how we're going to solve some of these problems. And in my still fairly short career, these are organizations that I've never seen talk to one another. Yeah. And so I think that there's something happening now that's quite excited. I am a bit of a cynic, but at the same time, I think that there's enough here that's happening that is quite exciting that, as I mentioned, we should be riding the wave and understanding how our organization, large and small, funder, community organization, corporation, et cetera, can fit in and support this.
So you're all involved in somehow, often with foundations, there's private sector money involved somewhere. There often is. I mean, money always ends up coming from somewhere. And one of the questions that comes up or has come up in the past is that the way forward is to hold that money accountable. So sort of, I've got a question here that talks about corporate social responsibility. And CSR has been a means of sort of holding people accountable. And I'm curious, do you think that the SDGs are in the same line of thinking, or how is it different in terms of how we're thinking with the SDGs? Is it an accountability question?
The organizations that succeed into the next generation will be those that are no longer generating the type of negative externalities that we saw organizations generate in the past. I think part of that's going to come with the educational shift that Stephen spoke about, but I think this idea that just CSR is enough, or that we just need to mitigate reputational risk, that's no longer the way in which businesses can fit into an agenda or a framework like the SDGs. It's going to require not just funding, but really a change in behavior. I think a change in behavior across sectors, so this isn't just pointed toward the private sector, but those that are really going to make a meaningful commitment and probably benefit from it are those that are going to really understand the ways in which every aspect of the operation of their business can be affected, influenced, and enhanced by something like the SDGs.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting now too, because we work a lot with government, right? And it's the same question. Government is always seeing itself as the CSOs are holding you accountable, holding you accountable, holding you accountable. But I really do detect a change in the talk and the flavor these days, in which it's not about being held accountable. It's actually about how do we actually solve this mutually, a problem that we actually all want to solve. Maybe that's the aspirational nature, is bringing us together a little bit more, because we all do want to see some of these things happen in the next little while. Maybe we all do realize we're in a crisis too. The next 15 years is really critical.
On accountability, one thing, we haven't really talked about climate change today.
Yeah.
But there's a movement within the investment movement called the 2-degree movement, which is to mobilize investors to get behind shareholder action that will hold companies accountable to figure out what their contribution is to the 2-degree increase in global temperatures, and then how to mitigate that or eliminate that. And I think that's a tremendous movement.
Yeah. In fact, I often think that climate change is probably, the focus on climate change in the COP meetings is probably a definite, what do you call it, like a major motivating force behind the SDGs and the time-bound nature of the SDGs. I don't think we really had that in the MDGs. Even the idea that let's just have poverty in the next 15 years feels like there's lots of time left after that. But the idea that we actually have to solve this problem by 2015 and that it's interconnected to all the other ones. And if we don't do that, then we're hooped as a species. It's probably the first time we've seen that. That's got to be climate change behind that. How much of climate stuff, when you're actually, I guess that's why you're moving into renewables too, and that you see that focus is one of yours.
Yeah, indeed. That was one of the drivers of it. Then we had a discussion about, whether we should be investing in utility scale renewables. Yeah. And then at the end of the day, we thought, we're still a relatively small organization. So let's use our money with the most impact. So we're going to be going more towards off-grid solar and community-based renewables rather than utility-scale renewables. Yeah,
well, fantastic. Well, now we're definitely at the end of our hour and a half. And so, Dan, do you want to pipe in here? Do you have any things that I know that you wanted to end off here?
No. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us, and to all the panelists, and to you, Mike, for doing the facilitation. I have nothing else to add. And if you want to say any last words, that'll be that.
Yeah, last words if you want them.
Last words is there'll be a recording. There'll be a recording. There'll be a recording available. There are some questions that were asked that we weren't able to address this time around, but we're looking to provide a summary report based on today's webinar, and there's also the webinar being recorded, and we'll make it available to all participants who've registered. So big thank you once again to everybody for attending, and I get the feeling we're just starting a conversation here, but it's an exciting one that's getting off the ground. So I'm looking forward to where this conversation will go and evolve, and to staying in touch with everybody.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.